Okay, starting off at the absolute basics. What I might do is get back to my own session and just show you a couple of little slideshows, which will give you some background information in terms of how all this stuff actually hangs together. I think PowerPoint's in here somewhere. First off, we'll just start with what actually happens behind the scenes when we are using Visage generally. So as you know, or as you may know, Visage itself is built using web technologies, which effectively means that the pages that you develop are just sitting on a web server. The major components is a workstation the client uses, the web server in the middle, and a database server. The client requests a URL from the web server. If you have integrated Windows security, it might ask you to log on from Windows. They're passed back to the web server, and then a container document is actually sent back to the workstation. It then goes and talks to the database to get a definition for a process. You can have log-on security from Visage itself, so it might ask you to log on to the Visage environment. It'll pass those details back to the middleware. That will eventually go back to the database, and the database finally tells the web server which pages to send out, and those pages are sent out to the workstation. A client can make direct access to a subroutine or a resource on the client. That happens via the middleware, and you just get the results sent back. Likewise, from the database, it can go and execute client-side script as well, so that in essence you get this ability of the clients being able to call server routines, the server being able to call client routines, and that whole area is basically just smeared and blurred and so forth. So although it's a three-tiered architecture, or a multi-tiered architecture really, you can treat it as if it's just this single unified environment, which we call the Visage runtime environment, or the VRE. For those of you that have a more technical bent, there is also the actual componentry in terms of what goes in to the architecture itself and how the bits and pieces are made up. And once more, if you want this, I can shoot it out on a slide for you, or else a PowerPoint for you later on. But the major components, as we just saw, are the workstation, the web server, and the database server. In terms of the client workstation, clients simply IE6 or IE7. Those of you who don't know, the IE8 beta was released last week, and we started proving that at this point in time. We tend not to finalise things for that until it's in its final release stage, but when IE8 comes out, Visage will be ready to fully support that. Also, just as background knowledge type stuff, in terms of things like Vista, which has iOS 7 in it as the web server, and also Windows 2008, which was released earlier in the month, Visage will quite happily run on that as either a client and also as the middleware component. Got to wait a while for the databases to catch up, but from our perspective, we try and leverage the Microsoft technology as best as we can. So in terms of that client, it implies a Windows client. That's to be able to use the full facilities of Visage itself. You can actually develop and design screens that will work in any JavaScript-enabled browser, but that's going to be with reduced functionality and so forth. Today what I'm going to focus on is primarily if you're talking about an internal application where you can dictate that the people are going to be using Internet Explorer. Nothing needs to be pre-installed on the client machines at all, so that basically you can just point them to a URL. We do, as we'll see, need the site that we're aspects to it, and we have all the client capabilities in the browser. Now what that means is if you wanted to access a web service, for example, that someone else is doing, or if you wanted to integrate an application to, say, Star Trek Express for freight tracking and so forth, because these guys already publish ways of doing that from within the browser, from the back end, we can simply fire off a request that has the browser go and do the work, bring the information back, and present that onto your screen or store it in the database wherever you want. So it enables you to be able to leverage all of those other things that are out there, because all of those other things, the world is moving towards the whole Net 2.0 and so forth, and things like service-oriented architecture and so forth, and Visage enables you to partake of that quite happily. Because when you actually look at a Visage application, the clients, as in your clients, don't know what the back-end database, don't care, and likewise to a large extent we don't either. We have the database out the back end which is executing some business logic and so forth, but because we have full access to everything the client can do, it also enables us to go out and leverage all of those things that are available out on the internet as well. So it's really quite exciting. Visage applications themselves operate in what's called a hypertext application. This isn't our word, it's a word that Microsoft have, and it basically, as its name sort of sounds like, hypertext, the HTTP is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. A hypertext application is an application that is designed to operate over the internet. So that's exactly what we do. We also use ActiveX controls in the applications themselves. So ActiveX has to be enabled in the browser itself. That's how we do things like producing graphs on the screen. We have things to view faxes and PDFs and all of those sorts of things. So we simply leverage ActiveX controls for that sort of stuff. These are load-on-demand type things. So it's things like the code editor, for example. If you're out on a client site and you want to go and edit some programs and you're on a PC that has never done that in the past, it will just come up and say, give you a dialogue that says, look, I need to download this ActiveX. You're happy to do that. Our ActiveXs are all signed, so people can be guaranteed that the things are actually coming from us. It will download that as a once-off type thing, and away you go. When we produce new versions of Visage, we may also, and usually do, produce new versions of the ActiveX controls as well. So as a new version, a complete version of Visage rolls out, clients on their first logon type request may be asked to download updated versions of those ActiveXs. So it's just a case of saying yes, install. It's a one-off exercise, and once they're downloaded, they're away and working. And as I said, that includes things like the code editor, graphing, the Bitcube viewer, and things like the report viewer and so forth as well. The ActiveXs have been developed by us using technologies and languages like Delphi and C++, and they're just standard Windows Internet Explorer components. There's nothing particularly special or fancy about them. And it's also possible for us to wrap third-party controls and so on. So we've had requests from people in the past to go and use product XYZ, and they wanted to be able to do it neatly and easily from the Visage environment. So it's possible to do that sort of stuff as well. On the client side, we also have an extensive script library. And this is just, rather than you having to become a JavaScript guru, it's like subroutine calls from your multi-value basic type thing. It just enables you to do things. And this is if you want to, but it's an integral aspect of the entire Visage runtime environment. It can be extended with your own script. You can use VB script or JavaScript. Most people tend to use JavaScript simply because it gives you greater portability out to other browsers and so forth. But once more, as we talked about before, it gives you full access to OLA technologies, the DOM, which is the document object model that you're actually working with. Everything that you can do out in the browser, you can actually access. And so if you had an application, you could go and open an Excel spreadsheet, load up a template, populate that template with data directly from your database. That template might have had graphs and so forth associated with it, and you suddenly have an application that's doing everything that the client wants in terms of Excel integration, graphing, one of the options we have for financial reporting these days is actually to just use Excel, and people set up templates and go do whatever they want that first slideshow, it's just a simple message passing environment. Messages being passed from the client to the back end will pass the message back to the client, which is typically a result. The biggest change, I suppose, that you need to get your head around is simply the fact that the client is disconnected from the main database itself. Right now, you write a subroutine that does something, you store the results in a local variable or something, and you're just running one program, and you come back 5 calls later and expect those variables to still be there. If they were just stored in simple pick basic variables, they're not going to be there. They would have gone, unless you actually used the VRE routines to actually say, I want to keep the value of this thing permanent between calls and so forth. But by and large, you don't have to worry about it. There are 2 ways you can do development, if you will, generally in Visage. One way is to keep doing what you're probably doing now. That's you have one large monolithic program that has lots of subroutines, either internal or external with it. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, my own personal preference is to decompose what you do down into smaller functional units, smaller subroutines that can be called, and over time you just make those more general purpose and so forth. So Visage itself started life as a great big monolithic program, and these days the largest program in Visage proper is probably about 100 lines of code. And that just makes life easier in terms of management and maintenance and so forth as well. In terms of communications between the workstation and the web server, that's just using standard TCP/IP. So it can operate over HTTPS, which is once more Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it can also use HTTPS, which is the secure version of that, so it has encryption and so forth for those communications. If you're talking about an application inside an organisation, behind the firewall and so forth, you may as well just run it as ordinary HTTP. There is obviously an overhead, a processing overhead associated with turning on the secure aspects of it, because everything has to be encoded and so forth. You can use it internally, it's not really a problem or an issue, but you just need to be aware of it. The other thing, just before we leave the workstation side of the client side of the equation behind, right now, if you haven't done anything in a web or a multi-tier environment before, you may be using terminal emulators like Accuterm or whatever the product is that's installed and loaded down with Universe and so forth. Yep. And in those environments, you could basically run a 286 alongside a quad-core Pentium 3 gigahertz machine, and running a terminal-based application, they would both perform at about the same speed, because there isn't really a great deal of stuff happening out of the client. It's basically, here's some data displayed on the screen, end of story. With Visage, and with anything that is using this multi-tiered architecture and so forth, to an extent, the client machine plays a big part in the actual performance experience that a client will actually see, because there is now processing taking place, there are scripts being executed. If you think about it, your standard screen that you're dropping down now to one of these green screens, for want of a better word, they probably have colours on them, is you're typically working, say, 24 lines, 80 characters, there's about 1920 individual characters. Now that means you can populate the entire screen with 2K being sent down. As I said, with Visage, we're talking about developing web pages, and your web pages are going to be 10, 20 times that size. So the amount of data that's physically shoveling backwards and forwards to give you pretty pictures and so forth on the screen, if you're running people at remote locations, needs to be considered and contemplated, because the physical amount of traffic just to get a blank screen up there is substantially greater than what it is with a standard ASCII-based type thing. Now once more, it is web. The first time you visit a page, it has to be downloaded. You can actually control whether those things are cached out of the client, so next time you go and visit, it's not quite as bad and so forth, which you would normally do. But once more, you just need to be aware that the speed of the client PC does play an important part in what people will actually see and perceive for the finished upgrading. And if you will, if these are your clients, it can actually be used as you want this, fine, but you need to go and get the additional hardware and so forth to support it. Try it, but as I said, just be aware that if you are using something that Noah used to use as a boat anchor, it's going to show with anything like this. Yeah. The other thing, the overall transmission of information between the client and the server and so forth is very efficient in terms of what it does. We've got a full page full of stuff there. If you've heard or read about the way that the internet and so forth works, you have a submit button and it sends down everything on the page and so forth. That isn't the way that Visage works. Visage only sends back things that have actually changed. So it's extremely efficient in terms of what it does. If it's sending out new data to populate a page, it doesn't resend the whole page. It just sends out the new data. It's only part of the page that needs to repopulate. It will only send out the data for that part of the page and so on. This is just background stuff. It's sort of, you can have the presentation and so forth, but it's just, I think, useful as we go through the thing, just knowing what's actually happening behind the scenes. So in terms of the web server itself, as I said, we've only got the change fields going back. The web server bit, as far as Visage is concerned, has to be Microsoft IES 5 or 6. You can use, if you're using 2008, it can also be iOS 7. But the web server has to be a Microsoft type platform, and that's simply because our middleware, the connective glue that we have that connects the internet or the clients to the back-end database is written around Microsoft technologies. So as I said, you can add 2008 to that list now. You can also run a web server out on a little Windows XP or a Vista machine. You need to be aware though that if you do that, there are limits that Microsoft put in place in terms of how many HTTP connections you can have. Realistically, it's okay for, say, a single user point of sale type thing. Above that, you start to hit that limit fairly quickly. We use static web pages, as I said before. You design a page and we actually generate a real live HTML page. That enables things like caching and so forth to work, whereas if you had technologies like ASP and so forth, where it's being generated on the fly each time, you don't get that ability of having static information cached out on the pages themselves. It uses a technique or technologies, DHTML, which is just dynamic HTML. These have been superseded somewhat these days by the AJAX type stuff, the asynchronous JavaScript, XML type things, but the underlying technologies are exactly the same. We don't use ASP. The processing model itself is simple and easy to understand. We have a management console type thing that enables you to go and see what's happening inside of the thing itself. The actual connecting piece of software is what they call MISAPI, which is Internet Server Application Programming Interface routine. It basically sits inside of IIS itself. So when this website starts up, the connective software starts up as well. So it's just a Windows DLL, it's loaded once, it's developed in Delphi. All of these things just mean that it's quick in terms of what it does, as opposed to technologies like CGI and so forth. And it's where the decoding and so forth of messages going backwards and forwards takes place. We also have the notion of connection pooling. And what connection pooling enables you to do is it's the thing that actually controls the connections from the web server back to the back-end database. So you can have one connection going into your database that is actually shared by a multitude of users. How many users can use that one pipe going in, you actually control to a certain extent. It's driven by the amount of horsepower the machine actually has, and also the amount of work that you're actually doing. Obviously, if you're doing a labour-intensive, every field you enter is validated out against the database, we obviously have to send a message back, is this record on file, send the drive 11 out of 2 and 22 or 23 out of 3 and so forth. But it's one of those things that depending on how your application is actually written and what it does and what the operators themselves do, that's going to have an impact. Bearing that in mind, although you don't need to know any JavaScript whatsoever to use this environment, obviously if there is stuff you can do out in the client side, if you wanted to add two numbers together, option one is go back to basic because you know how to do that, so send a message, get the result, put it back. The other alternative is just do that out in the client side. Every piece of logic that you move from the database out to the client is probably a piece of logic that you will never need to change again. Because if you move from D3 to Universe, which is a possible path, or you're coming from Universe back into D3, the code that you write out on the browser is totally agnostic to what the actual back-end database and so forth is. And that's, once more, why we have these client-side libraries out there that enable you to do stuff without having to go back. You don't. Majority of the things that you're likely to want to do initially, that becomes a non-event anyway because we just look after a whole lot of stuff for you. We also map URLs to connection pools. Now what this means, if you have a web server, you can have multiple websites running from it. You might have an accounts website, a point of sale website, a internal and external debt recovery type thing, or you might just have one website that everyone hooks into. It doesn't really matter. But each website has its own pool of connections associated with it. Could be that you're running, this is a service bureau for someone, so that off one machine you've got multiple people's accounts hooked into, and you've got multiple back-end accounts and so on, and depending on the URL that they're coming in, the web address, so to speak, that will map them out to the appropriate accounts and so forth out the back end. But it also means that if you have an environment where you know that some people are just using the system for inquiries and so forth, if you wanted to, you could actually have those use a different pool of licenses to people that are doing the head-on telesales or something similar. Because obviously, the more times you need to hit the database, the lower the ratio is going to be because it takes physical time to transmit that down, run the return on the back end, and transmit it back. And overall, that connection pooling allows you to optimize your connections into the database. You're in a situation now where clients have got connections out to the database, so it's a non-event, but you just need to be aware also that there's some routines I can show you later when we're actually monitoring websites and so on, where you can see if you need to add additional connections into the database or not, right? So the system will quite happily run overworked. Your users will probably not quite happily run overworked because they're hitting a button and they're going to want to get a response back in under 5 seconds, and when it takes over 5 minutes, we have chaos. That's right. So there are some monitoring capabilities in there that will enable you to see whether you need to add those additional connections in. As we said, the web server, we have our own management console in for the stuff which enables things like the mapping, web space stuff, the communication parameters, and statistics, which is ultimately what we're looking at in terms of do we need to get some additional connections into the database. The web server is actually the thing that physically connects to the back-end database. That connection runs as a service under Windows. Once more, it's been written under Delphi. It hooks into the database just using a scripted telnet connection. So there's no sockets, there's no complicated stuff. It just logs on the same as you would with your ordinary terminal emulator at the moment. And you can also use SSH if you need to there for secure environments, or it could be that you have your web server outside the firewall, the database is behind the firewall, and you don't want unencrypted information travelling across the two of those. And it's basically just a pipe server to the ISAPI, which is the piece that lives inside the web server itself. We maintain permanent connections to the database so that when Visage starts off, it connects into the database and it will stay connected. So it's not logging on, logging off, and so forth, because that will take time. So basically, when the Visage server starts, it goes in, starts these lines, and they will stay logged on, even though multiple people may use them. Right? Now that also means that if you're coming from an environment where you are reliant or you check on things based on the line number that someone is on, the different connections out of the back-end database. So there are things that you may need to change to take that into account in terms of what's actually taking place. The things are basically stateless. Once more, this is just a technical term. It means that we're not permanently connected from the client. The environment is also self-healing. So if you have a program that bombs out, hits a debug statement or something similar, the Visage middleware will detect that it's not answering properly, will break that connection and relog the thing back on. Now there are other things you can do. You can actually run the pick basic debugger from the Visage window if you want, but you need to actually set that up in place. So if you did have a program bomb out like that, you can hop into the debugger and put your debug commands in and step through that as well, which is sort of cool if you think about the fact that you're coming from a non-persistent connection. The back-end database thing, it's all just basic code. It's a very efficient messaging engine. It's leveraging the smarts that we've provided out on the client and also the middleware. Some of the intelligence is actually out there. As I said, we've gone through this evolution ourselves so that the product is very modular in terms of what it does rather than being a large piece of monolithic code. That also helps us to be nimble in terms of what we do as well. And if you think about it, if you had a single subroutine that can be called anywhere that goes and does something, if you need to change the way that that something actually works, well, it's easy. It's in one spot, it has a clearly defined interface, and that's it. So we sort of borrowed a whole lot of really good ideas from mainstream stuff in terms of object-oriented orientation and so forth. If you have existing subroutines and so forth that you have developed, you can still reuse those. There's no real problems. You can actually just do a straight call out to any basic subroutine. There's also routines in place to do common initialization. We don't use ordinary common, so to speak, so if your subroutines that you have pre-existing are using ordinary common, it's the stuff we have a label in it. The two can quite happily coexist, but it needs to be reinitialized. We just give you a hook where you can go and set those initial common variables up. But as I said, your programs may need to change because if you're reliant on things that are based around a PIB being as a constant thing, you can't guarantee that at all. And obviously if you've got back-end batch update routines and so forth, you can reuse that logic quite easily. We also have a thing called snippet technology. It's basically a recursive, extensive precompiler. This is something you don't have to take use of, but if you do, it can be quite nifty. If you ever had a routine along the lines of loop, read next OK equals 0. Loop, read next ID, else OK equals 0. While OK, do read a record from a file, read a lot probably, go and do some processing, repeat. Like common structures that you use over and over again in programs. And what snippet technology allows you to do is basically build those up as a skeleton, and it effectively becomes your own macro language. So you can go and put your own one line of code in that will actually go and generate 5, 10, 50, 100 lines of code out the back end. And then if you suddenly discover a smarter way of doing things, like, okay, rather than doing locates in this thing where we have to go and remove it, or for I equals 1, 2, decount, whatever, and you suddenly discover that if you traverse backwards, you don't have to evaluate the decount each time. Or if you start to use the remove statement for those loops, you can just go to your library, restructure how that thing is actually done, and recompile your code, and everywhere that had that structure and thing in it now uses a faster, more efficient way of doing things. It also allows you to do version and platform specific type stuff. So what that means is you can write your applications and have it do different things, whether it's, say, running on a Windows host operating system as opposed to a Unix host system. Or if you're using Universe, it can do different things in Universe 9.6 than what it will do in 10.1 or 10.2. Or you can not worry about that at all. But case in point, I suppose, here is Visage itself. We have one version of the source code. We use snippet technology, and we simply say, go and generate me a version of Visage for D3, or go and generate me a version of Visage for Universe, and it will use the right optimized code for that environment and host platform and so forth. So it's excellent in terms of enforcing standards, obviously. also makes it much easier to adopt new technologies and new ways of doing things, and having everyone doing exactly the same thing. It effectively allows you to build up your own grammar that's specific to the task that you actually do. And that, at the end of the day, leads to increased productivity as far as you guys are concerned. That's the thin edge of the wedge. The real payback for this sort of stuff, there have been various studies done over in the States in terms of what does it cost to write a line of code over the lifetime of the product. Anyone want to take a guess what the actual cost of writing a line of code is?
Writing a line of
code.
Just
single line of code over the lifetime of the product.
At least 10 times the time that it originally took.
Dollars. My stats are based on dollars. $1, 20, 30 cents. Average line of code over the life of a product is $500 a line. By the time you take into account how many times people are going to have to come and revisit it as you're looking at doing modifications and enhancements and maintaining it, it's a staggering thing. You don't spend it up front. Now, admittedly, these stats are coming from the real Windows guys, so there could be other things, but it's also an interesting statistic. So every line of code we can stop you from having to write by using these libraries and so forth. That's not just the saving that you make up front in terms of not having to write those 20 lines of code, but then not having to go and change them when the things happen and so forth down the stream. So yeah, it's absolutely amazing.
Good stuff.
And that in turn comes back down to a decreased maintenance load as well. If you use this, as I said, if you've got these super macros, so to speak, in your own code, it obviously makes life a lot easier to implement changes and so forth. And you can do one change in one place that will impact everything everywhere correctly. So we also have a big subroutine library out as part of Visage itself that gives you access to the client resources. We have object-oriented type extensions in the database. Right now you write code along the lines of open my file to my file variable, read rec from my file, customer name might be in field 2, so you may have customer rec angle brackets 2 and go and do something with customer name or something. You can use that, there's nothing wrong with using that still, but I would suggest if you are changing a routine, and certainly if it's going to be Visage only, you can just now use a reference that's file name underscore whatever the actual attribute name is, and we'll go and read the file if we need to, lock it if we have to, extract the data out if we have to, and you don't need to worry about where it is. That becomes important if you're going to be interfacing out to other third-party products and so forth, where they might not have stored the customer name in the first attribute. It might be in the 73rd or something similar. So you can simply go and change your dictionary, and you don't have to recompile any program whatsoever, and it'll just happen. So it just enables you to work in a more abstracted version of the database on the big side of things. So we have this whole data abstraction level that's in there. And it also gives you some high-level functionality, like you can just call a routine that does useful stuff, like go and update everything that I have to update for this particular file. We automatically take care of managing state, so it's not something you need to worry about. But and once more, if you get into really huge stuff, it enables you to spread stuff out over the web farms, multiple web servers out the front and so forth. Until you're talking humongous numbers, don't need to worry about that. And we give you the core of Visage is a process management control type thing that just lets it know how to handle the messages. There's no special add-ins back on the database server except to make things work. If you're talking about Unix or Linux or AIX or something, you would probably want to have Samba on that, or NFS just to share a common file space with the Windows server, or you can also use anonymous FTP if you want. Our preference is in the order that they appear here. Samba is probably best and easiest, quickest. NFS and anonymous FTP if nothing else will work. And we also make use of named pipes in those environments as well. So, we have phantoms running in the background to do various housekeeping type stuff, like running scheduled tasks and so on. So you can set a task to run automatically at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now it might be do a backup, it might be do also interact with the Visage screen, so if you have a big update run that you're doing and you want to give the user some feedback in terms of what's actually happening, so you can be doing that update as a phantom task, but it can still communicate to the user screen. And also do housekeeping tasks like getting rid of defunct sessions and so forth that are in there. And of course these phantoms don't consume licenses either from the Visage perspective or from the database vendor's side of the equation either. The technology that we use to connect is proven, simple. It's what's been happening for the last 30, 40 years into the database. It's just telnet or SSH. That means there are fewer things to break. We tried to get various things working on various environments and they just kept on breaking, and in the end we just came back to telnet. It was simple. We have smarts within the middleware itself, and at the end of the day it just offers a much easier path to integration. We have a technique or a thing, one of the gamuts we run for is this philosophy of trying to actively reduce the amount of code that you actually need to write. That's why we develop things like the snippet technology. ACR for us is very important, because if we can help you to not have to write 10 lines of code, not only is it 10 lines of code that you don't have to write, it's 10 lines of code that shouldn't break either. And once more, if you have a look at your programs now and look at the amount of duplication and so forth that's actually in there, that can be a scary sort of thought. And once more, if you're starting off with a heritage of something that's already written, you're limited somewhat in terms of what you can actually do, but we have one of our focuses for developing Visage is looking at ways of reducing the amount of code you have to write. Part of that also comes by using what we call smart dictionaries. D3 Universe and so forth have got dictionaries, but they've never really played an important part in developing your pick basic code, and okay, you use them for reporting and so forth, but we've sort of taken those dictionaries and made them an active partner in the overall development of the application itself. And also things like intelligent filters and so forth in there. So we try and remove where you might now have stuff hidden in code and buried somewhere, and it's okay for the people that know that it's there, but anyone else coming along who's got absolutely no idea what it is, we're just trying to lift all of those little hidden gems out of the actual code and put them up out into the dictionaries and files and so forth, so it's clearly visible to everyone. That's the environment in a nutshell of where things actually work. So we've got the clients, the middleware, the database, written in various technologies and so forth. Variation to the theme, I suppose, is that. So that's what's happening in their architecture. You don't have to worry about any of that really, but as I said, I think it's just useful to know what's actually happening behind the scenes when you click the button and actually have something to do. So what I might just do, I'll just stop this